The coins were cold. Caleb Torres pressed them flat against his palm and counted them one more time, even though he had already counted them twice on the walk over. $3.17, 2 quarters, 6 dimes, 9 nickels, and 12 pennies that he'd fished out from between the couch cushions, from the little ceramic dish on the kitchen counter where Rosa kept the loose change she forgot about, and from the sidewalk crack in front of the Morrisons' house on Alderton Street, where a penny had been sitting for at least 3 days because nobody else had bothered to bend down for it. He'd bent down for it. He was 11 years old, and he understood, in the specific grounded way, that children who grow up watching adults count things understand, that 17 cents mattered. It always had. It probably always would. The November wind came off Riverside Park's old stone fountain and cut straight through the front of his jacket, which had been Marcus Delgado's jacket first, then handed down to Marcus's younger brother, then passed along to Rosa Torres at the church clothing swap last spring, because it was technically Caleb's size, even if the left zipper stuck, and there was a small iron-shaped burn on the right cuff that nobody had ever explained. He didn't mind the jacket. It was warm enough in most weathers. November in Millbrook City was not most weathers. He kept walking toward the food truck. Washington's Riverside Grill sat parked at the east end of the park every Saturday from 9 in the morning until the food ran out, which on cold days was usually around noon because people didn't linger the way they did in summer. The truck was older, and with a hand-lettered menu board propped in the service window and a small space heater inside that you could feel from 3 feet away when the window slid open. The owner, a short man named Dale with a mustache that had been exactly the same shape for as long as Caleb could remember, made the best French fries in the neighborhood. Everyone knew this. It was not a matter of opinion. Caleb had been thinking about those fries since Thursday. If you're already feeling something, go ahead and hit that like button and drop us a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love knowing who's out there listening to these stories. Now let's get back to Caleb, because you're going to want to know what happens next. The small order cost $2.75. Well, Caleb had calculated this before he left the apartment, standing in the kitchen while Rosa pulled on her second uniform of the day, the pale blue one from the office cleaning company, not the gray one from the laundromat, and kissed him on the top of his head without slowing down. She moved fast when she was running behind, which was most days. Be back before dark, mijo. There's rice on the stove. Don't let it sit too long or the bottom burns. He promised her he wouldn't. The apartment on Clement Street was 3 floors up in a building that smelled like other people's cooking and the particular kind of damp that came from a roof that had been patched more times than it should have needed patching. It was a 2-room apartment, 1 bedroom, 1 everything else room. And Rosa slept in the bedroom, and Caleb slept on the pull-out couch that had a bar in the middle of the mattress that he had learned to sleep around by curling slightly to the left. He had been sleeping that way since he was 8, since his mother had gotten sick and Rosa had brought him here from the hospital without quite explaining how temporary or how permanent the arrangement was going to be. He was 11 now. He had stopped expecting an explanation. His mother, Carmen Torres, had been 29 years old when the stroke happened. She was 31 now, and she was alive, which was the thing Caleb held on to most days with both hands. She was in the Millbrook City Extended Care Facility on Haverford Road, in a room with a window that looked out onto the parking lot. And she recognized Caleb when he visited, and she could squeeze his hand. And sometimes she smiled in a way that started on the left side of her face and didn't quite make it all the way to the right. The doctors said that was as good as it was going to get for now. The doctors also had a lot of opinions about things that cost money Rosa didn't have, so Caleb had learned to listen to them politely and then watch Rosa's face after to see what was actually true. Rosa Torres was 64 years old, and she worked 6 days a week between the laundromat on Millbridge Avenue and the overnight cleaning contract at the Farber and Cole office building downtown. She was built like a woman who had never once considered the option of stopping, short and solid. A woman with hands that were always slightly chapped from the detergent at the laundromat, and a way of carrying herself that made strangers underestimate her, and people who knew her understand very quickly that they shouldn't. She had raised Carmen. She had raised two cousins before that, when their father left and their mother couldn't manage. She was now raising Caleb, and she did it with the same unhurried, inexhaustible certainty with which she did everything else. She never once made him feel like a burden. That was the thing Caleb thought about sometimes, late at night, when the bar and the couch mattress made sleep complicated. The way Rosa had never in 3 years made a single sound or gesture or expression that made him feel like his being there was something she had settled for. She had folded him into her life the way you fold something into dough, not around it, not underneath it, but through it, until you couldn't tell the shape of the original apart from the thing it had become. She cooked rice and black beans on Sunday and left portions in labeled containers in the refrigerator for the days she wouldn't be home. She went to every parent-teacher conference and sat in the small plastic chairs with her hands folded in her lap and asked questions that told Caleb's teachers she had read everything he'd ever brought home. She told him most evenings over whatever dinner they managed, at least one story about his mother when she was Caleb's age. Not sad stories, stories meant to make him laugh. She was good at those. Money was the part of their life that didn't have any give in it. Now, Rosa was honest about that in the way practical people are honest about difficult things. Straightforwardly, without drama, without apology. They had what they had. They needed what they needed. The distance between those two things was managed with care and without complaint. And Caleb had learned from watching Rosa that complaining about the distance was a waste of energy that could be better spent closing it. He had spent the past 2 weeks closing it in the direction of French fries. 4 lawns raked on Alderton Street, $2. Mrs. Kim's grocery run, 50 cents. Helping Mr. Patterson drag the old washing machine out to the curb, 75 cents. The couch cushions, the change dish, the sidewalk penny, 42 cents. $3.17, and the small order was $2.75, which meant he would have 42 cents left over in the rice on the stove, and a Saturday afternoon that was entirely, uncomplicatedly his. He ordered at the window. Dale slid the paper tray through without much ceremony, but he added 3 extra fries along the bottom, the way he sometimes did with the kids who came by themselves, without making any comment about it, which was the kind of kindness that didn't need an audience to count. Caleb said thank you and meant it, and took his fries to the first bench inside the park entrance, the one near the old stone fountain where the water had been turned off for winter, leaving the basin empty except for a scattering of fallen oak leaves going soft at the edges. He sat down, pulled his jacket tighter with his free hand, and ate the first 3 fries while they were still hot enough to matter. That was when he saw the old man. He was sitting on the bench at the far end of the fountain, the one that faced the path rather than the trees, set slightly apart from the main foot traffic in the way of someone who had chosen the spot deliberately rather than landed on it by chance. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that had settled all the way into a person and was no longer something they were becoming but simply something they were, with white hair combed neatly to one side and a coat that was clean and pressed but plain, the kind of coat that didn't announce itself. He had a small paper bag on the bench beside him, and he was pulling small pieces of bread from it with slow, unmethodical fingers and dropping them onto the path for the pigeons that had gathered at his feet. There were 6 pigeons. He was feeding them with a patience and attention that suggested he had been at this for a while and intended to continue for a while longer, and that this was not a thing he was doing to pass time, but a thing he was doing because the doing of it mattered to him. In some way, Caleb couldn't entirely identify from 30 feet away, but could recognize as real. Nobody else was paying him any attention. The Saturday park crowd moved around him the way water moves around a stone, around, past, through, without acknowledgement. A woman in a bright yellow running jacket jogged by with earbuds in and her gaze fixed at the middle distance. Two men walked past, deep in a conversation about something involving a car that one of them had borrowed. A young couple pushed a stroller through, the baby bundled so thoroughly only its face was visible, and they passed within 6 feet of the old man's bench without looking over. He didn't look up either. He just kept pulling bread from the bag and setting it on the path. Caleb ate 2 more fries and watched. He wasn't sure what made him keep watching. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. The old man wasn't in any obvious distress. He wasn't crying or calling for help or in any of the clear situations Caleb had been taught to respond to. He was just sitting alone on a park bench on a cold Saturday morning, feeding birds with a careful, solitary attention. And then something about the quality of that solitude, the particular way a person looks when they have made their peace with the fact that they are by themselves, sat in Caleb's chest in a way that was uncomfortable in a very specific direction. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on Rosa's face sometimes, late on Sundays when she thought he was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee cooling beside her and her hands folded and her eyes somewhere else entirely. He had seen it on his mother's face through the window of the extended care facility before she saw him coming down the hall and her expression changed into something different. It was the look of someone who was waiting for company that hadn't come yet and was trying to be okay about it. That was when the 2 boys appeared. Derek Chen and Brant Holloway were in the grade above Caleb at Millbrook Intermediate and had a shared talent for identifying situations where they could make themselves feel larger by making someone else feel smaller. Caleb knew them the way you know the particular weather patterns in a place you live, not because you study them, but because you had been caught in them enough times to read the signs. They came around the corner of the path at the same speed and with the same loose performing energy of boys who were looking for an audience and hadn't found one yet. Derek spotted the old man first. "Hey, old-timer." He said it loud enough for people nearby to hear, not shouting, but pitched carefully at the volume that wanted to be overheard. "You know those birds don't actually like you, right? They're just hungry," Brant laughed. The kind of laugh that had already been decided before anything funny happened. The old man looked up from his pigeons. He looked at the 2 boys with an expression that was difficult to read. Not frightened, not particularly surprised, but something measured and careful, the expression of someone deciding something before they responded. "My wife used to say the same thing," the old man said. He said it quietly, without any performance in it. "She said, 'Edward, you could be made of bread, and they'd still leave you the moment it ran out.'" His mouth shifted slightly at the corner. She wasn't wrong about most things. Derek blinked. That response hadn't been in the script he'd been running. Brant had already lost interest and was looking at his phone. "Whatever," Derek said. It had less power than he'd intended, and he seemed to know it. So he moved off down the path. Caleb watched them go. He looked back at the old man, whose name was apparently Edward, who had gone back to his bread and his pigeons with the same quiet attention as before, as if the interruption had been a weather event, something that happened and passed and left the underlying landscape unchanged. Caleb looked down at his fries. There were still a good number left, more than half the tray. Dale's extra 3 were still in there along the bottom. He made a decision before he had finished making it, which was how his best decisions usually happen. He picked up his tray and walked to the far bench. He stopped a couple of feet away. The old man heard the footsteps and looked up. His eyes were pale blue and very clear, with the kind of clear that makes age look less like deterioration and more like weather that has scoured something down to its essential shape. Caleb held out the tray. "I have too many fries," he said, which was not entirely true, but it was a way of offering that didn't make the other person feel like a project. Rosa had taught him that without using those words. "Can I share them with you?" "It's fine if you don't want to. They're from Dale's truck over there." They're pretty good. The old man looked at the tray. He looked at Caleb with an expression that moved through several things in the space of a few seconds. Surprise, something that might have been the beginning of something deeper, and then a warmth so unguarded it made Caleb feel like he had done something more significant than he'd meant to. I would like that very much, for the old man said. He moved slightly on the bench, making room. Please, sit. Caleb sat. The pigeons moved forward hopefully. The old man dropped another piece of bread, and they descended on it with the focused energy of creatures who understand that the world contains food, and that the only relevant question is whether it is currently available. Are they always here? Caleb asked. The old man pulled bread from the bag and placed a piece on the path. Same 6, every Saturday. He pointed. That one with the mark on its wing? That's Gerald. He's been coming since March. He looked at Caleb with that clear, pale gaze. Pigeons remember you. Did you know that? They are more loyal than most people give them credit for. Caleb had not known that. He said so. They sat for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which Caleb noticed because uncomfortable silences had a texture to them, and this one didn't. He offered the tray. The old man took a fry with the deliberate care of someone accepting something offered genuinely rather than out of obligation. He ate it slowly and looked out at the path. Thank you, the man said. He said it with a particular weight, not out of proportion to a French fry, but with a sincerity that suggested the thank you was for something slightly larger than the immediate transaction. Caleb said you're welcome. What's your name? The old man asked. Caleb. Caleb Torres. The man extended his hand formally, the way adults did when they meant it. Edward Whitmore. He shook Caleb's hand with a firm grip that didn't condescend to be gentle just because the other hand was smaller. Do you live near here, Caleb? On Clement Street, 5 blocks. He gestured vaguely in the right direction. My grandma's at work, so I come here on Saturdays sometimes. He took 2 fries. It's usually pretty quiet this time of year. Edward nodded. Quiet is something I have developed a complicated relationship with, he said, and he said it with the dry, precise humor of someone who had spent a long time choosing words carefully. He looked at the empty fountain basin. I used to come here with my wife, Margaret. We lived not far from here earlier in our lives before. He paused, made a small contained gesture with one hand, before everything became what it became. He looked at the pigeons. This bench was hers. She liked the fountain. She said the sound of it was like a conversation with something that wasn't trying to want anything from you. Caleb thought about that. Nah, that's a good reason to like a fountain. Edward looked at him with the faint expression of someone recalibrating a first impression. Yes, it was. She had a gift for finding the right reason for things. He reached into the paper bag for more bread and then paused. I'm sorry. You don't want to hear an old man talk about his dead wife on a Saturday morning. You came to eat French fries. I don't mind, Caleb said, because he didn't. My mom had a stroke when I was 8. She's still here, but she can't. He stopped, organized the next part. She can't really talk the way she used to. So sometimes I just sit with her. He shrugged, a small, honest movement. I figure sitting with someone is still something, even if you're not saying anything. Edward was quiet for a moment, and he dropped the bread piece onto the path and watched Gerald descend on it with practiced efficiency. That is a very wise thing to understand at 11 years old, he said finally. It took me considerably longer. How old are you? Caleb asked, and then added quickly, is that rude to ask? My grandma says sometimes it's rude to ask. Not from you, Edward said. I'm 78. Are you still working? The old man's mouth curved with something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. That is a question I am currently negotiating with several interested parties, he said. He looked at the path ahead, at the people passing without looking at him, at the trees dropping the last of their November leaves onto the gravel in small defeated spirals. My son believes that at 78, a man should do less negotiating and more resting. What do you think? Edward was quiet for long enough that Caleb thought maybe he had pushed past a line, but the silence wasn't the closed kind. It was the kind that happened when someone was deciding to tell you something real. I think, Edward said carefully, that the moment a man stops being useful is the moment he starts disappearing. He paused. My son is a good man, but he has confused retirement with erasure. He does not intend to, but he is. His jaw tightened for just a moment, then released. He is trying to solve a problem I don't have by removing things I'm not ready to give up. Caleb didn't entirely follow all of it, but he understood the feeling underneath it. Like when people tried to help in ways that weren't quite help. Like when someone gives you old clothes and they make a big thing out of it, Caleb said. So you feel like you're supposed to be grateful in a specific way that costs you something. Edward looked at him with an expression that had become, in the past 10 minutes, the particular attention of a person who is encountering something unexpected and has decided to pay close attention to it. Exactly like that, Edward said. He took another fry from the tray Caleb was still holding between them. Exactly. The wind moved through the park, scattering oak leaves across the path and ruffling the pigeons into brief disorder before they settled back to their positions. The fountain sat cold and empty. Down the path, a dog walker with 3 dogs of dramatically different sizes navigated the conflicting priorities of her charges with the diplomatic air of someone who had accepted the complexity of her situation. Caleb finished his fries. There was a small cluster of the shorter ones at the bottom, and he tilted the tray toward Edward in silent offering. The old man took 2. Do you come here every Saturday? Caleb asked. Most Saturdays, Edward said. More often lately. He said it with a quality to it that suggested lately was a word with weight. That something had changed in his life that had made this bench and these pigeons and the empty fountain become more regular features than they had previously been. My security detail, he added, which was an odd addition to the sentence, finds it a somewhat anxious habit, and they prefer I stay where they can manage the perimeter. He said it with such complete matter-of-fact dryness that Caleb almost missed it. He looked at the old man. You have a security detail. Edward looked mildly amused. For my sins. What do you do? Caleb asked. Like, for work. Real estate, Edward said. Buildings, mostly. Some other things. He was quiet for a moment. I built the city's first pediatric rehabilitation center about 15 years ago. He glanced sideways at Caleb. On Haverford Road. Caleb went very still. Haverford Road was where the extended care facility was, where his mother was, where he rode the bus every second Sunday with Rosa through 3 neighborhoods and 1 transfer, to sit in the room with the parking lot window and hold Carmen Torres' left hand and tell her about his week until the visiting hours were over. Well, that's where my mom is, he said. Edward turned to look at him fully for the first time. The rehabilitation center? No, the extended care. Next door. I know the building, Edward said. He was watching Caleb with that careful, clear gaze. His voice was quieter now, shifted into something more deliberate. What's your mother's name, if you don't mind? Carmen. Carmen Torres. Edward nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the path ahead, where the last few pigeons were pecking at the faint remainder of the breadcrumbs, finding smaller and smaller pieces as the supply ran out. From the inside pocket of his coat, his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, and something moved across his expression that Caleb couldn't entirely read. A tightening, brief, one the expression of a man seeing a name he had complicated feelings about. The screen was visible for just a moment before Edward turned it face down on the bench beside him, but Caleb saw the name displayed above the phone number in clean large letters. Arthur Whitmore Corp. He did not answer it. The phone buzzed twice more, and then was quiet. Edward looked at the empty bread bag in his hands. He folded it precisely along its existing creases, the kind of folding that suggests a lifelong habit of tidiness, and placed it in his coat pocket. "You are a kind boy, Caleb Torres," he said. There was no theater in it. He wasn't performing warmth. He was simply saying a thing that he appeared to have concluded was factually accurate. "You shared your food with a stranger, and you asked nothing about it." "My grandma says kindness is the only thing you don't lose by giving away," Caleb said. Edward was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother is a very wise woman. She works 2 jobs," Caleb said, "and she reads every night before she sleeps, even when she's really tired." He thought about Rosa, coming through the door at 11:12, setting her bag down in the hallway and going straight for the shelf where she kept 3 paperbacks rotating on a cycle. "She says books are the one thing she doesn't have to share." Edward smiled. It was a real one, not the restrained, measured version that seemed to be his public face, but something fuller and warmer and with a quality to it, like something long stored in a quiet place. "She sounds," he said, "like someone worth knowing." "She is," Caleb said, it with the simple certainty of someone for whom this was not a complicated conclusion. Down the path, 2 park joggers passed. A pair of older women with matching windbreakers and a synchronized walking pace talked to each other about something that made them both laugh. A child chased a pigeon with the dedicated optimism of someone who had not yet learned that this never worked. Life moved around the bench in its usual Saturday rhythms. The old man and the boy sat in the middle of it, the empty fry tray between them, the paper bag folded neatly in the coat pocket, 6 pigeons working through the last crumbs with the patient efficiency of creatures who trusted that the bench would be here again next Saturday with more bread. "I should probably start home soon," Caleb said. Not because he wanted to leave, but because the light had moved, and he had promised Rosa about the rice. "Of course," Edward said. He straightened slightly on the bench, and in the movement, something changed in how he held himself. Not stiffened, but returned to a carriage that suggested something larger than the simple old man in the plain coat. "Yes, you should." He looked at Caleb with an expression that carried something he was deciding whether to say. "It is not a small thing," he said finally, "what you did today." He held Caleb's gaze steadily. "I would like you to know that." "I just shared fries," Caleb said. Edward Whitmore nodded. He did not argue the point, but something in the quality of his attention, the particular weight with which he said what he said, suggested that his accounting of what had happened and Caleb's accounting of it were operating at slightly different scales. The boy stood. He tucked the empty tray under his arm, the way Rosa had taught him, so it could go in a trash can and not on the path. "Will you be here next Saturday?" Caleb asked. The old man looked at the empty fountain, at the bench, at the 6 pigeons settling back into their loose, indifferent assembly around his feet. "I believe I will," he said. "Okay," Caleb said. He meant it simply, the way he meant most things. "I'll come back then." He walked back down the path toward Clement Street, hands in his pockets against the cold, the wind following at his back now instead of cutting into his face. At the gate, he turned once, and the old man was still there, sitting with the same contained, solitary patience as before. Oddly, but something about the angle of him was different, the way he held his head, and it took Caleb a few seconds to identify what had changed. He was watching Caleb go, not looking away, not back to the pigeons, not at the path or the fountain. He was watching with the fixed, careful attention of someone who had encountered something unexpected and was not ready yet to stop looking at it. Caleb raised a hand. Just a simple wave. Edward raised his in return, a small, deliberate movement. Then Caleb turned and walked home, past the food truck where Dale was stacking trays and thinking about closing early, past the dry cleaner on Millbridge, already gated for the day, past the church where the notice board read, Community Clothes Swap, Saturdays. All welcome, and where Rosa had found his jacket last spring, and past the building on the corner with the broken number on the door, so that it read 48 instead of 48. Up Clement Street with the cold November air coming off the river 2 blocks west in long gray sweeps. The rice was starting to catch at the bottom by the time he got home. He turned it off in time. He sat at the kitchen table and did his homework and thought, without quite meaning to, about the way the old man's phone had buzzed and he hadn't answered it, about the name displayed on the screen, about the way Edward Whitmore had said, I built this city's first pediatric rehabilitation center, with the plain, unadorned certainty of someone stating a verifiable fact about their own life, about the way he had said what you did today is not a small thing, with that weight to it, that specific and careful weight, as if he were filing it somewhere important. Caleb ate his rice and beans at the table with a pencil in his hand and his notebook open, and the apartment was quiet around him with the particular quality of rooms that will be occupied by people who are not yet back. And he thought about next Saturday and about the bench by the empty fountain and the 6 pigeons who apparently remembered people who were kind enough to show up. He figured he would show up. It was, after all, what Rosa had always said. You never know which ordinary Saturday turns out to matter. The second Saturday was colder than the first. Caleb wore an extra sweater under the jacket with the stuck zipper and got to the park bench by the fountain at 10 in the morning, which was earlier than he'd come the week before. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd left the apartment earlier. He told himself it was because Rosa had started her laundromat shift at 6, and the apartment was quiet in a way that made staying in it feel less like resting and more like waiting. And the park was at least a kind of waiting that involved fresh air. He sat on the bench for 11 minutes before Edward Whitmore appeared at the path entrance with his paper bag and his plain coat and his careful, unhurried walk. And the 6 pigeons materialized from the surrounding trees with the synchronized efficiency of an advanced team that had been monitoring the situation. Edward stopped when he saw Caleb already on the bench. A slow smile moved across his face, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the rest of the expression. He sat down without preamble. You came back, he said. I said I would, Caleb said. Edward looked at him for a moment with that quality of attention that Caleb had been thinking about, intermittently for the better part of the week, without quite being able to name what it was. It was the look of someone who was not accustomed to people doing what they said they would do, and was still recalibrating their expectations to account for the possibility. So you did, Edward said. He opened the bag and pulled out his bread. You did indeed. They talked about Gerald the pigeon for a while, which led to Edward explaining that pigeons had been used as message carriers in both world wars, which led to Caleb asking how you attached a message to a pigeon, which led to a 15-minute conversation about avian anatomy and the history of military communication that Caleb followed with more attention than he gave most of his classroom lessons. Partly because Edward explained things the way someone explains things when they genuinely find the topic interesting, rather than when they think you should find it interesting. He brought it up in school on Tuesday. His teacher, Ms. Harrigan, looked mildly surprised and said that was correct. And where had he read that? A friend told me, Caleb said. He hadn't thought of it that way until he said it. Then he thought about it for the rest of the day and decided it was accurate. The third Saturday, Caleb brought a bag of his own. He had spent some of the previous week's leftover change, not the 42 cents from the fries, which he had put back in the change dish because Rosa needed it more than he did, but 30 cents he had earned helping Mrs. Patterson carry up her groceries from the taxi, on a small loaf of bread from the discount rack at the corner store on Millbridge. The loaves on the discount rack were the ones that were 2 days from their printed date, which meant they were still perfectly good, but sold for 50 cents instead of $1.49, which was a system Caleb had learned from Rosa and applied with the same practical lack of embarrassment she brought to it. When he arrived at the bench and pulled the bread from the bag, Edward looked at it and then at Caleb with an expression that contained something that was difficult to define precisely, but that felt to Caleb like being seen clearly by someone who was paying real attention. You didn't have to do that," Edward said. "I know," Caleb said. "Gerald likes the softer kind better. I noticed last week he goes for yours before the others do." Edward was quiet for a moment. "He did," he agreed. "He does." He pulled a piece from the loaf Caleb offered him and set it on the path, and they watched Gerald descend with his characteristic, purposeful, diagonal approach. "Caleb," Edward said. He said the name in the tone of someone opening something deliberate rather than making conversation. "What is your grandmother's last name?" "Torres. Same as mine. And she works 2 jobs, you said. The laundromat and the cleaning company downtown, the Farber and Cole building. She does the overnight contract with 4 other ladies on the team." Caleb broke a piece of bread and put it near the edge of the path, where a smaller, less confident pigeon was hovering. "They won't let her work more than 30 hours at the laundromat, or they'd have to give her benefits, so she does the cleaning to make up the rest." Edward said nothing for a moment. He looked at the pigeons. "And your mother, Carmen, she is at the extended care facility permanently?" "The doctors say so. For now." Caleb didn't look away from the birds. "There's a therapy program that could maybe help her recover more, a speech 1 and a motor skills 1 combined. But it costs money the state program doesn't cover, and the insurance." He stopped, not because the words weren't there, but because he'd heard Rosa explain this particular sequence too many times, always in the same precise, resigned order, always arriving at the same wall. The insurance doesn't cover the gap between what the state pays and what the program actually costs. "How much is the gap?" Edward asked. He asked it the way a person asks a question when they want an accurate answer rather than a comfortable one. "Rosa said last time it was $430 a month," Caleb said. "She's been trying to figure it out since September." Edward folded a piece of bread very precisely and placed it on the path. He said nothing else about it. He did not offer anything or make any gesture or change the subject in the way people sometimes did when money came up, and they either had too much of it or didn't have enough. He simply sat with the information the way he sat with most things, with a stillness that suggested he was filing it somewhere important and intended to think about it seriously. Caleb appreciated that, the sitting with it rather than the rushing past it. He told Rosa about Edward on the 4th Saturday, or rather on the evening after the 4th Saturday, while they were eating rice and beans and the last of a rotisserie chicken Rosa had found marked down at the market. He had been mentioning him in passing since the 2nd week. "There's an old man at the park I've been talking to. He goes every Saturday." But this was the first time Rosa put her fork down and looked at him with the focused attention of a woman who had raised children long enough to understand when a passing mention was actually something more. "Tell me about this man," she said. "He's old," Caleb said. 78. He brings bread for the pigeons, and he knows a lot about a lot of things. He used to come with his wife, but she died." "What does he do?" Rosa asked. "For work. He said real estate. He said buildings." Caleb thought about it. "He said he built the rehabilitation center on Haverford Road." Rosa's fork, which she had picked back up, stopped moving. She looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual because Rosa's expressions were generally not difficult. "He built it," she said. "The one next door to where your mother is. He said so." Caleb looked at her carefully. "You okay, abuela?" Rosa set her fork down again. She was quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when she was thinking through something serious. Then she picked the fork back up and resumed eating. "Just be careful, mijo," she said. "People aren't always—" She stopped, started again. "When someone seems kind and they have a lot of power, you should be careful about what you tell them. About us." Caleb thought about this. Edward doesn't feel like that, he said. Rosa looked at him with something complicated moving behind her eyes. I know you feel that way, she said. I'm not telling you to stop going. I'm telling you to be thoughtful about what you share. There's a difference between kindness and strategy, and from the outside, they can look the same. She said it gently, not as a warning so much as an inheritance, a piece of information she had earned through experience and wanted him to have. The same way she passed on everything she knew about discount racks and how to make one chicken last 3 meals. Caleb thought about it the whole walk to the park the following Saturday. He thought about Rosa's face when he'd mentioned the rehabilitation center, and the way the fork had stopped. The 5th Saturday, Edward wasn't there when Caleb arrived. He sat on the bench and waited. 9 pigeons gathered and dispersed in rotating waves, finding no bread and adjusting their expectations philosophically. The park moved through its usual Saturday patterns around him. Dale opened the truck early because of a school group coming through. 2 young boys chased a soccer ball across the grass with the physics-optional confidence of people who hadn't yet learned about trajectory. At 11:15, Edward appeared at the path entrance. He was walking faster than usual. The measured, deliberate pace that Caleb had come to associate with him was compressed into something tighter, and his face had the carefully neutral quality of a man managing something beneath the surface that he had not yet decided whether to discuss. He sat down. He had forgotten his bread. Caleb noticed immediately but didn't say anything about it. He waited. "Everything all right?" he asked after the silence had settled for long enough to show it wasn't going anywhere on its own. Edward looked at the empty fountain. "Not entirely," he said. He pressed his palms flat against his knees in a controlled gesture. "My son filed a legal motion this week. He is asking a court to review my capacity to manage my own affairs." Caleb didn't know all the words in that sentence, but he understood the architecture of it. He wants to be in charge of your stuff, in somewhat more clinical terms. Edward's voice was dry, but there was something underneath the dryness. It's tightly leashed. Yes, he and his attorney argue that my recent, and here the word came out with a precision that suggested it had been used against him, eccentricities suggest I may no longer be fit to make financial and operational decisions. What eccentricities? Edward looked at the path ahead. Coming here for one. Spending time in neighborhoods I have no financial interest in. Reducing my formal public schedule. He paused. Establishing what Arthur's attorney referred to, in an actual legal document, as unusual social patterns inconsistent with my historical behavior. Caleb frowned. But you're just living differently than I used to. Yes. Edward's jaw tightened for a moment and then released. Arthur is a careful man. He doesn't act without reason. The reason, in this instance, is that Whitmore Corporation's board of directors is preparing for a significant vote in 3 weeks on a proposed development project, a very large one, and Arthur believes, correctly, that my vote on that project will not align with his preferred outcome. He was quiet. Caleb waited. The project would demolish 4 city blocks in the Millbridge district to build a high-end commercial complex. He said Millbridge the way someone says the name of a place they know well. The current tenants, small businesses, community services, a clinic, a housing cooperative, would be displaced. The financial return is very substantial. The cost to the community is also very substantial, in ways that a balance sheet does not capture because it was not designed to. Caleb thought about Millbridge Avenue, the laundromat where Rosa worked, the corner store with the discount bread rack, the church with the clothing swap, the dry cleaner that had been there as long as anyone could remember. My grandma works on Millbridge, he said quietly. Edward turned and looked at him. Something passed across his face. I know, he said. You mentioned it. They sat for a long moment. If your son gets control, Caleb said, does the project go through? Without my opposing vote, yes, almost certainly. Edward looked at the pigeons circling in hopeful, foodless patterns. I have been fighting it through legitimate channels for 4 months. My position has been consistent and grounded in both ethical and financial reasoning that I believe genuinely is sounder than Arthur's. He paused. Last week, my son apparently decided that fighting me on the merits was taking too long. He said it without hatred, and with a particular weary grief of someone describing a wound that did not come from a stranger. How long has he been your son? Caleb asked. Edward looked at him. It was an odd question. 51 years, he said. That's a long time, Caleb said. He doesn't want to hurt you on purpose. He just wants the thing more than he wants to not hurt you. Edward was very still for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and quiet. That is one of the most accurate things anyone has said to me about this situation, he said. And I have had 3 attorneys and 2 therapists speak to me about it at considerable length. Caleb shrugged. Rosa says that's the worst kind of hurt. The kind from someone who loves you but wants something more than they love you. Edward pressed his palms against his knees again. He looked at the fountain. He looked at the path. He looked at the 6, now 7, pigeons that had gathered in the stubborn anticipation around the bench. I don't have bread today, he told them. I'm sorry. Caleb reached into his bag and pulled out the small half loaf he'd brought from the discount rack. He held it out to Edward without ceremony. Edward took it. He pulled a piece and placed it on the path. The pigeons descended. Thank you, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it the first Saturday, with that weight to it that was about more than the bread, and both of them knew it and neither of them needed to say so. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The following Tuesday, Caleb came home from school to find Rosa at the kitchen table with her laptop open, which was unusual because Rosa's laptop was usually only open on Sunday evenings when she paid the bills and tracked her hours. She looked up when he came in with an expression that had several things layered in it. She turned the laptop toward him. The screen showed a news article. A photograph at the top of it showed a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit standing outside a glass tower, looking at something off-camera with a composure that could have been confidence or controlled tension. It was difficult to tell which. Below the photograph, in clean, bold letters, the headline read, Whitmore Corp in Crisis, Sun files competency challenge against billionaire founder Edward Whitmore. Caleb read the headline twice. Then he read the first few lines of the article. Then he looked at Rosa. She was watching him carefully. That's your friend, she said. The man at the park. It wasn't a question. She had known before she showed him. She had looked it up. Caleb looked at the photograph again. The composed, silver-haired man in the expensive suit did not look exactly like the man who fed pigeons from a paper bag and forgot his bread when he was worried. But the shape of the face was right, and the pale blue eyes were right. And there was something in the way he held himself, even in a press photograph, that Caleb recognized. Edward Whitmore, the article said, founder and majority shareholder of Whitmore Corporation, the city's largest privately held real estate development firm. Net worth estimated at $1.4 billion. A man who had built 17 major commercial and civic projects across the city over 50 years, including, in the 4th paragraph, the sentence that Caleb read 3 times. In 2009, Whitmore funded and personally oversaw the construction of the city's first dedicated pediatric rehabilitation center on Haverford Road, donating the initial endowment of $40 million from personal funds after the city council declined to fund the project publicly. Caleb sat down across from Rosa. She closed the laptop slowly. I should have looked it up sooner, she said. I had a feeling when you mentioned the rehabilitation center. I've seen his name on the donor wall there when I take you to visit your mother. She folded her hands on the table. I just, I didn't want to make something out of nothing if I was wrong. So Caleb looked at the closed laptop. He thought about every Saturday, about Gerald the pigeon and the military messaging history and the discount bread. And Arthur doesn't want to hurt you. He just wants the thing. About the way Edward had said, I know when Caleb told him Rosa worked on Millbridge, in that voice that was quiet and deliberate and filed things somewhere important. He doesn't know that I know, Caleb said. No, Rosa said. He doesn't. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her grandson across the kitchen table, with the expression she wore when she was making up her mind about something and wanted to arrive at the conclusion herself without interference. Does it change anything? She asked. The way you feel about him? Caleb thought about it honestly. No, he said. Wait, because the person who comes to the bench every Saturday is the same person, whether his name is in the newspaper or not. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the nod of a woman who has asked a test question and received the right answer and is satisfied. Then you go on Saturday, she said, and you're the same too. You don't treat people differently because you know more about them. She tapped the table once, lightly. That's what dignity looks like, mijo. On both sides. The following Saturday was the one where everything changed. Caleb arrived at the bench at his usual time. Edward was already there, which was also usual now, and the pigeons were arranged in their regular configuration, and the paper bag was in Edward's hand. And it looked, from a distance, like every other Saturday that had come before it. But when Caleb got closer, he saw Edward's face. It was the face of a man who had slept badly and was carrying something he hadn't put down yet. The careful composure was intact, but thinner than usual, like paint over a crack, and Caleb could see the crack underneath it, because by this point, he had been looking at Edward Whitmore's face across a park bench for 5 Saturdays, and he had learned the difference between the controlled version and the real one. He sat down. He didn't say anything immediately. He put the bread bag between them and waited. The court, Edward said finally, without preamble, has scheduled a hearing. 2 weeks from Monday. Arthur's attorney filed additional documentation this week, including, his jaw tightened, including surveillance photographs and behavioral logs compiled over the past month. And they have been documenting my activities, apparently. My deviation from what they term expected conduct for someone in my position. Caleb said carefully, what counts as deviation? This, Edward said. He gestured at the bench, the fountain, the park. Coming here, feeding birds, talking with... He stopped. His voice did something he clearly had not anticipated, and he managed it by stopping and breathing once through his nose, and then continuing. Talking with a child he met on a Saturday morning who shared his French fries without asking for anything. He looked at Caleb steadily. They have photographs of us, he said, on this bench, taken from a distance. Arthur's legal team used them to argue that I have formed an attachment to an unknown minor that demonstrates social confusion and reduced executive function. Caleb felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling of something being taken. They think you're confused, he said, because you talk to me. They think I am confused because I made a choice that a man with my resources would not conventionally make. Edward looked at the empty fountain. And they are using that choice and the friendship it produced as evidence that I am not fit to make decisions about my own company and my own life. He said the word friendship with the particular precision of a man who was choosing to name something directly when he could have chosen not to. What happens if they win? Caleb asked. A guardian is appointed, likely Arthur, with oversight from the board. My voting rights are transferred. The Millbridge project proceeds. He paused. And I am moved onto a residential facility that Arthur believes is more appropriate for my needs. A place, he said, with a quality to his voice that was very controlled and very tired, where no one feeds pigeons in November. That's not right, Caleb said. It came out with more heat than he intended, but he didn't take it back because it was accurate. You're not confused. You're just living different than you used to. That's not the same thing. Edward looked at him. No, he said, it is not the same thing. But the law does not always distinguish between the two as carefully as it should. He reached into his coat pocket. He removed something and held it for a moment in his palm, looking at it, and then he held it out to Caleb. It was a small card. Cream-colored, heavy stock, with a name and a phone number printed in clean, understated type. Below the name, one in smaller letters, Mitchell and Associates, Personal Legal Counsel. I want you to have this, Edward said, in case anything happens before I can... He stopped. In case things move faster than I expect them to. Caleb looked at the card. Who is this? My personal attorney. Not the corporate team. That is Arthur's domain now, effectively. My own man. He has represented me for 30 years, and he is loyal to me specifically, not to the company or to anyone else. He looked at Caleb steadily. If you cannot reach me, if something changes and you need... He stopped again. If you need to know that I am all right. Caleb took the card. He held it flat in his palm and looked at it and thought about everything that was built underneath that sentence. Everything Edward had decided to trust him with by putting that small cream card in his hand. I looked you up, Caleb said. After last week, he said it directly because anything else would have been a form of the strategy Rosa had warned him about, and he had decided he was not going to be that. Edward was still. He looked at Caleb. My grandma showed me the article, Caleb continued, about the hearing, about Arthur, about the project. He met Edward's pale blue gaze without looking away. I knew who you were before I came today. Edward said nothing for a long moment. His hands were quiet in his lap. And you came anyway, he said. It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered it. You're still the same person who was here last Saturday, he said. Knowing more about someone doesn't change who they are. Something moved across Edward Whitmore's face that Caleb had never seen there before. Not the controlled warmth of their usual conversations, and not the restrained, dry humor that he used the way some people used an umbrella as a way of managing exposure. Something without any protection over it at all. He pressed one hand briefly over his eyes. A single, contained gesture. Then he lowered it and looked at the pigeons and breathed once, slowly. Margaret would have liked you very much, he said. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that had been allowed through just for a moment that was not steady. She would have said that you prove her point. What point? She used to argue, he said, that the real measure of a city's health was how its children behaved when nobody was watching. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Caleb had yet seen from him. I used to say that was an impractical metric for urban development. He paused. I have not said that in some time. From the path behind them, footsteps approached. Deliberate, measured footsteps, the kind that came from shoes that were not worn for walking in parks. Both of them heard it at the same moment, and both of them turned. Two men in dark coats were approaching along the fountain path with the unhurried, purposeful movement of people who had been sent to accomplish something specific and had no doubt they were going to accomplish it. The taller one had a folder under his arm. The shorter one was already looking at Edward in the specific way of someone who has a task and is locating its object. Mr. Whitmore, the taller one said. He said it cordially, airy with the practiced neutrality of a professional doing something someone else had decided. My name is Daniel Reeves. I represent Whitmore Corporation's legal team in the matter of... I know what matter, Edward said. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from the bench. His voice had the quality it must have had in 50 years of boardrooms. Quiet, final, completely certain of itself. I am currently engaged. The man with the folder glanced at Caleb. The glance was brief and clinical, a category assignment, minor, uninvolved, irrelevant to the task. It was the most dismissive thing Caleb had encountered since Derek and Brant had walked past the bench on the first Saturday, and it had a similar quality. The quality of someone deciding that you were not worth the effort of actually seeing. Mr. Whitmore, Reeves said, as the hearing date has been moved, it's been accelerated to this coming Thursday. Judge Harlan agreed to expedite given the company's board meeting timeline. He opened the folder. There are some documents that require your signature before. Edward stood. He stood with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is not going to revisit it. And at his full height in that plain coat with the pigeons scattering slightly at the movement, he looked different than he had looked sitting on the bench, not larger. Larger was not quite the word. More precisely himself, as if standing had made the outer edges of him clearer. I will not be signing anything in a public park on a Saturday morning, he said, at the direction of my son's legal team. You will contact my personal attorney, whose information you already have. I'm going to arrange a meeting through proper channels during business hours on a business day. Reeves opened his mouth. This conversation is concluded, Edward said. The pleasantness was entirely gone from his voice now, replaced by something that was not unkind, but was completely immovable. Good morning. He looked at Caleb. For just a moment, beneath the composure, Caleb could see the thing underneath it, not fear, something older and more complicated than fear. The look of a man who understood, with full clarity, that the ground beneath him was shifting and that he had a limited amount of time before it shifted too far to recover. Then Edward Whitmore straightened his coat. He looked at the two men across the fountain path with the calibrated stillness of someone who had learned over 78 years when that the most powerful thing you could sometimes do was refuse to be moved. He looked back at Caleb. He smiled, and it was the real one, the warm one that lived underneath all the other versions. Same time next Saturday, he said. Caleb held the cream-colored card tight in his palm. Yes, he said, same time. The two men from the legal team stood where they were. Edward turned and walked back down the path toward the park entrance, his footsteps carrying in the cold air, unhurried and deliberate all the way to the gate. Caleb sat on the bench for a long time after. Gerald the pigeon moved up and ate a piece of bread directly from the path in front of him, close enough that Caleb could see the iridescent shimmer in his feathers, that improbable oil-slick purple and green that pigeon wings carried even in November. He looked at the card in his hand, at the name, at the number, at the weight of what had been placed there. Then he put it in the inside pocket of the jacket with the stuck zipper and the iron-shaped burn on the cuff. He put it where it would not fall out, where it would be there when it was needed. He had a feeling it would be needed soon. He stood, picked up the bread bag, and walked home through the cold. Down Millbridge Avenue, past the laundromat, past the discount rack store, past the church notice board, past the dry cleaner, past every building that sat on the 4 blocks that someone with a balance sheet and a board meeting and a son who loved him in the wrong direction wanted to tear down and replace with something that would generate returns that a spreadsheet could capture and that a community could not. While Caleb walked all the way home without stopping and went straight to Rosa, who was home early for once, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her book. He sat across from her and put his hands flat on the table the way she did when she was about to say something serious. Abuela, he said, I think I need your help. Rosa looked at him over her coffee cup. She looked at his face, reading it the way she read everything, carefully and with full attention. She put her book down. Tell me, she said, and Caleb told her everything. Rosa made one phone call. Mitchell and Associates answered on the second ring. By Wednesday morning, Edward Whitmore's personal attorney had filed a counter motion supported by 5 character witnesses, Rosa's testimony about the Millbridge community, When in one unexpected submission, a handwritten letter from an 11-year-old boy describing, in plain and careful sentences, every Saturday at the bench by the empty fountain. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge dismissed Arthur's petition entirely. The Millbridge project was voted down the following week. Edward's vote held. Caleb Torres was enrolled in the full rehabilitation program the month after. Edward paid the gap himself. Every month, without announcement, without condition. Caleb found out from Rosa, who found out from the billing office, who had received instructions from a private account listed simply as a friend. He went to the park that Saturday. Edward was already there. Gerald was already there. Caleb sat down. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did Edward. When they shared the bread and fed the pigeons and watched the city move around them, and that was enough. That had always been enough. Some things don't need to be named to be real. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.